family and community structures, you can have an increase in domestic violence and sexual assault in the context of social and economic marginalisation. On the other hand, immigration can sometimes expose individuals or families to other cultures that have less tolerance for violence than their own traditional culture may. So it can work in positive or negative ways. Second, where you have large movements of people across borders in search of work or in search of money or whatever, often those people are vulnerable to exploitation, and in particular, women and girls are often especially vulnerable to sexual exploitation through trafficking, through prostitution, including forced prostitution, to rape and murder and so on. And for example, I read the United Nations Special Rapporteur's report on violence against women in Mexico, and it's argued that undocumented immigrant women in Mexico are especially vulnerable to rape and murder because they don't have access to legal and police systems. You know, police aren't always very good at responding to violence either. And so immigration and colonisation can make particular groups of women, children and men more vulnerable to violence. Third, you gave the example of France, and in Australia too, violence against women can become, the issue of violence against women can become a tool of racism. To make the claim that a particular group, a particular ethnic group, are barbaric, uncivilized, and that they are, prone to raping women or, beating women. And in Australia, this happened 2 years ago. There were a series of gang rapes by young Lebanese men from immigrant young men from Lebanon in Australia. And this was used by conservative and right-wing commentators to argue against immigration, to argue these barbaric people come to our country, behave in this barbaric way, we should send them home. And of course, I and others were critical of the racism that was being fueled here. But I also have to say that violence against women is not evenly spread across cultures and communities. It is true in Australia, for example, that some ethnic groups have a higher tolerance for violence against women than other ethnic groups. That in some communities, 15% of men think it is okay to beat your wife. In other communities, it's 30%. And so we have to somehow speak about ethnic and cultural differences in understandings of violence against women while trying to avoid racism, and that's a very difficult task.
Yeah. Can I just make a point? Were you finished there?
Yeah.
One point about that. I think this issue of migration is very interesting too. And I guess for me, I totally agree with you about you need to recognize the differences in levels of acceptance for violence and also different levels of violence. I guess I make my intervention here today being very aware of the privileges of whiteness. And one of those privileges is not to necessarily be questioned. And I'm very aware of how Sweden is kind of upheld as one of these models that also sometimes make it more difficult for white Swedish researchers and activists to actually question what's problematic in our own cultures. It's very, very easy to slip into the racializing kind of discourses about the others. And I think we could see these difficulties in, for example, the problems we've seen in Sweden with some young men from ethnic, kind of second-generation immigrants from, say, the Middle East, mostly. And when they display quite woman-hating and woman-abusing kind of behaviors and attitudes, it's kind of automatically attributed to their kind of native culture. But I think we need to think much more carefully about what happens when constructions of masculinity, which are tied to dominance over women from one culture, merges with constructions of masculinity that follow a different logics, but also is tied to gender inequality. For example, as I hear some of these young men, they combine masculinity as individual freedom to do whatever you like, which is quite strong in Swedish culture, with masculinity as dominance of women. So they say, when young women ask them, so why should I obey you? They say, I have a right to choose, and I choose to dominate you. So we need to think much more carefully about the kind of dynamics when different forms of masculinity merge, and different forms of logics, you could say, of gender oppression merge.
Vamos a hacer otra ronda de preguntas. Estaban por aquí adelante, una, y vamos atrás ahora. Sí.
¿Yo? Bueno, ok, gracias. Bueno, primeramente felicitarlos a ambos, a María y a Michael, sobre lo que nos han expuesto esta mañana. Y bueno, pues para mí queda una sensación de focos rojos bien interesantes que me gustaría comentar, especialmente para el tema de políticas públicas. En México me parece que apenas estamos discutiendo cómo integramos a los varones en políticas públicas, y la discusión está muy fuerte en el tema de violencia, sobre todo porque quienes hemos investigado el tema sabemos que si no diseñamos lo que denominamos algunos rutas hacia la equidad en temas sensibles para varones, pues entonces esta premisa de género como relacional pues está quedando corto. En cuanto a estas cuestiones que planteaba María, a lo que podemos ver como efectos no deseados de estas acciones en el caso de guardia custodia, me parece bien interesante porque en el 97 aquí en México se dio una discusión en la Cámara Federal, en la Cámara de Diputados, sobre la licencia de paternidad. La iniciativa quedó en comisiones, nunca pasó a pleno, y entre los argumentos que se decían es que todavía los varones en México y la cuestión cultural estábamos abriendo ahí la posibilidad de que si se abría la licencia de paternidad, posiblemente muchos hombres se iban a ir a la cantina y no iban a ejercer esta licencia de manera adecuada. Hubo un debate en Comisión de Equidad y Género muy fuerte y bueno, no prosperó. En este sentido, la pregunta o la reflexión que me gustaría que ustedes hicieran es cómo hacer para que estas acciones que pueden ser en el ámbito legal vayan acompañadas de cambios culturales también, porque sucede lo mismo con la ley de violencia. Ya la mayoría de los estados en México ya tienen la ley de prevención y atención, y sin embargo todavía hay núcleos culturales muy fuertes de género que no se han atendido y por lo tanto la ley no puede avanzar a la par que los cambios culturales, que son mucho más lentos. Y el otro asunto es también cómo tocas estructuras desde estas propuestas de políticas públicas. Y recordaba que también cuando se dio el debate en la federal sobre la violación en el matrimonio, la violación conyugal, había diputados que decían que era el abuso de un derecho, ¿no? Y que eso no se tenía que legislar.